She was listed in Section IV of the estate inventory, between the linen press and the kitchen coppers, under the heading Domestic Fixtures and Assets in Continuous Employment. One line, no age, no station, no acknowledgement that the name referred to anything with a heartbeat. Just 8 years of her life reduced to a weekly value in shillings and a note in the solicitor's tidy hand, to remain with the household upon transfer of title per the indenture of 1814. Nell learned about it the way she learned about everything that happened in Greave House, standing very still in a doorway with a dustcloth in her hand, because a woman with a purpose had a reason to be near a room, and a woman without one did not. The solicitor, a dry man named Driscoll who smelled of coal smoke and old leather, was reading the inventory aloud to Mr. Gowan Ketch in the study while Nell pretended to polish the brass wall plate just outside. Driscoll read the furniture, the silver, the carpets, the horses in the stable yard, and then he paused and read one more entry, and Nell set the cloth against the wall very carefully, because she did not trust her hands. She had been a domestic, she had always known that. 8 years in this house had taught her the precise shape of what she was. But there was a difference between knowing your station and hearing yourself named in a property ledger between furniture and copperware, as a thing to be passed from one pair of hands to another with the curtains and the candlesticks. Ketch heard it and said nothing unusual. That was the first thing she noticed. A man who was losing his house, or rather, a man who was selling a house that was not quite his to sell, ought to have looked like a man in difficulty. But Gowan Ketch, who had managed the Greville estate for 8 years as its appointed trustee, and had managed it, by Nell's private accounting, very poorly for himself and worse for the land, stood in his good coat with his hands clasped behind his back, and said only, "Sound. Leave it as it is." He was not ruined, he was relieved. Nell went back to the kitchen with the dustcloth over her arm and said nothing to Maisie, who was rolling pastry at the kitchen table, and who had a gift for reading silence. "Trouble?" Maisie said without looking up. "Nothing new," Nell said. That was not true, but some things had to be carried alone until you understood their full weight. The buyer arrived at 11 o'clock, and Nell watched him from the window above the stable yard. She had expected someone like Ketch, florid, comfortable, the kind of man who bought land the way other men collected paintings, for the pleasure of ownership rather than any attachment to the thing owned. But the coach that came up the drive was plain black, unmarked, drawn by matched bays that moved with a quiet efficiency that cost more money than crests on carriage doors ever did. A man who needed you to know he was wealthy announced it. A man who did not need you to know anything arrived like this. The Duke of Aldenmoor. The name moved through the house the way water moves through old stone. By the time Nell heard it spoken aloud, it had already reached every corner. She had not thought a duke would come to Greave House. Dukes concerned themselves with estates that were worth concerning themselves with. Whatever had brought this one to a mortgaged property in the middle of nowhere? It was not the silver plate or the worn carpets. She should have returned to the kitchen. Everything she had learned in 8 years told her that clearly. She did not return to the kitchen. She watched him step down from the coach, and the first thing he did was not look at the house. He looked at the horses. He walked past Ketch's outstretched hand, past it as though he had not seen it, and went to the stable yard rail where the horses stood, and walked down the line of them slowly. He stopped at a dark chestnut with a white sock, and stood with his hand on the animal's neck, for a long moment very still. Nell knew that particular stillness. It was the stillness of a person who has just recognized something they were not expecting to find. Then he walked inside, and the whole company scrambled after him. She went down to the hall. They had laid the inventory on the long table for his inspection. That was the custom. And Ketch was talking about the property's advantages with the warmth of a man describing something he was only too glad to be rid of. The Duke of Aldenmoor was not listening. He had picked up the inventory. He read the way Nell scrubbed floors, methodically, line by line. He did not skim. Ketch talked about the millwrights and the water boundary and the acreage, and the Duke read, and the silence where his responses should have been grew heavier by degrees until even Ketch's fluency began to thin. The Duke reached Section 4. Nell watched him stop. She watched him read the line beneath kitchen coppers. 6 various sizes. She watched his eyes move over it once, and then again, slowly, the way you reread something you cannot quite account for. Not because the words are difficult, but because they should not exist. The room had gone very quiet. The Duke of Aldenmoor set the inventory on the table. He looked up. His gaze moved across the assembled men, without pausing, crossed the room, and came to rest on Nell, standing against the far wall in her gray dress with her hands folded in front of her. She did not look away, though every year of her life in that house told her to. Something passed across his face. She could not name it before it was gone. "Who drew up this clause?" he said. His voice was level enough that the stillness of it was more alarming than anger would have been. Driscoll cleared his throat. "It reflects the terms of the existing indenture, Your Grace, all properly witnessed." "Bring me the deed," the Duke said, "and a pen." Maisie found Nell in the laundry room an hour before supper, and she did not bother with preamble. "The Duke's steward came to the back entrance," she said. "You're to be in the drawing room at 9 tomorrow morning. The Duke wants to speak with you." She paused, studying Nell's face with the careful attention of a woman who had watched the same person for a long time and knew every variation of its stillness. "He asked for you by name, not by position." Nell sat down on the laundry bench. "He asked what name I went by here," Maisie continued. "I told him Nell. He wrote it down, and then he said, these were his exact words, 'I need to speak with the woman in the gray dress.'" She folded her hands. "Nell, who are your people?" "I have no people. My father died in debt, and I came here to work it off." "That's the story you were given." Maisie said it without accusation, matter-of-factly, the way she said everything. "It isn't quite the same thing as the story being true." "You read. Don't think I haven't noticed these 8 years. You set a table the way it was set wherever you came from, and that was not a servant's house." She turned back to the window. "Go in tomorrow with your head up. Whatever he asks, you answer him plainly. Don't shrink." Nell lay awake most of that night, hearing her. He was already in the drawing room when Nell arrived. No steward, no lawyers, just the Duke of Aldenmoor standing at the window in the gray morning light and the long room between them. He was younger than she had supposed, 30, perhaps a little more, dark-haired, plainly dressed, with a face that offered nothing. He did not look cruel. She had prepared for cruelty the way you prepare for cold weather, layering yourself against it in advance, and the absence of it caught her off guard. He was tired. She recognized it immediately because she had seen the same tiredness in every mirror she had passed in 8 years. He turned from the window when she entered, and he did not sit, so she could not sit, and they stood facing each other across 8 feet of old carpet. "You know who I am," he said. "The Duke of Aldenmoor, Your Grace. And you are Nell." He said the name carefully, as though it were a shorthand for something longer. "Is that what you were called when you came to this house?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Not before." The question landed strangely. She looked at him. "I don't take your meaning, Your Grace." He studied her for a moment. It was not the look men usually directed at servants. Nothing dismissive in it. Nothing that slid past her to somewhere more interesting. It was the look of a man comparing what stood in front of him to something he had carried for a long time in his mind, checking it carefully against a memory. "Yesterday I read your name in a property ledger," he said, "listed between furniture and kitchen equipment as an asset to be transferred with the household. I want to understand why, because that is what I am to them." "That is not what I asked." There was an edge to his voice, small but distinct. The first she had heard from him. A domestic in service is not property. She is not a fixture to be listed in a deed of sale. That is not done, and in point of fact it is not legal, and the man who wrote it either did not know the law or did not care about it, or wanted very badly for you to be something that could be handed off without anyone thinking to object. He took a step closer. "So I will ask you what I came here to ask. How did you come to Greave House?" Nell had answered that question 100 times in 8 years. She had the answer worn smooth with use. And then she heard Maisie's voice in her head. "That's the story you were given." She was quiet for a moment. "I was brought here when I was 12, she said. "My father had died. I was told there were debts, that Mr. Ketch, as the appointed trustee, had the legal right to my service until they were cleared. I have been clearing them ever since." She paused. "I don't know that they were ever real." Something shifted in his expression. "Do you remember anything before you came here? The house you came from? Who brought you?" "A carriage," she said. "A woman. She told me to be brave and that someone would come for me. She gave me something to keep before she left me at the door." She stopped. "I've kept it hidden ever since, because it was the only thing I had. I don't know if someone was ever truly coming." The Duke reached inside his coat. He drew out a small oval miniature in a tarnished gilt frame and held it out to her on his open palm. Nell's breath stopped entirely. It was her mother's face. She knew it with a certainty that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with the way your own blood recognizes itself. She knew it because she had a music box in the lining of her mattress upstairs, sewn in with careful stitches and re-sewn every time the seam began to fray, and inside the music box was a second miniature. The twin of this one, the same woman, the same gilt frame. And on the lid of the box a name was scratched in a hand she had spent 8 years trying to decipher. "I ask," the Duke said quietly, watching her face, "because 8 years ago I returned from a commission abroad and was told that the daughter of my father's oldest friend had died in her guardian's care. A fever, they said. Quick. Sad. Common." His voice stayed even. "I grieved her. I had known her since she was a child. She used to follow me about the stables at Greville Park when she could barely. I taught her to ride." A pause. She held a cup the way her mother did. "I used to tease her for it." Nell's hand rose to her chest without her meaning it to. "The estate," he said, "should have passed to her outright on her father's death. All of it, the land, the house, the income, everything. Instead, it passed into the management of a trustee, a distant cousin, on the grounds that the heir had died. And the trustee has been drawing the income ever since." He looked at her steadily. "Yesterday I came to Greave House because of a water rights boundary, a practical matter. Nothing more. I read an inventory, and I found a name, not the name they put in the death register. Her real name. The family name. The one that appears in her father's Bible." He closed his hand around the miniature. "And I need you to tell me whether the woman who brought you here left you with anything to keep. A box. A letter. Something with that name on it." The drawing-room door opened. Gowan Ketch came in with his papers under his arm, and his easy smile already in place, and his eyes moved from the Duke to Nell and back again very quickly, and the smile stayed exactly where it was, but something underneath it went very careful and very still. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace. I was told you wished the deed countersigned today. I've had everything prepared." He set the papers on the table with a small flourish. Whatever business you have with the staff can certainly be concluded afterwards. I'd hate to waste a great man's morning." The Duke looked at him. "This," he said in a tone that meant something altogether different from the words, "won't take long." The music box was gone. Nell knew it before she reached the top of the servants' stair. She had slept in that attic room for 8 years, and she knew the particular quality of its silence, and this morning it held a different kind, the silence of a space that has already been searched and found and emptied. She knelt beside the narrow bed and pushed her hand through the seam in the mattress. Her fingers found straw and nothing else. 8 years of careful hiding, 8 years of restitching the same seam in the dark by touch alone, because she had no candle of her own. The miniature inside, her mother's face, her own name on the lid in her father's handwriting, the handwriting she had spent 8 years learning to read because it was the only letter he had ever left her. Gone. She went to the window in time to see Ketch's traveling case loaded into a hired coach on the drive. He came out of the house at his own unhurried pace, a man concluding ordinary business, not fleeing. She had watched him manage impressions for 8 years. He was very good at it. She ran for the stairs, and the Duke's name was already in her mouth. He did not chase the coach. She came into the drawing room breathless, with the torn seam threads still under her fingernails, and told him it was gone, that Ketch had taken it, that the coach was already on the drive, that they had to go after him, and the Duke of Aldenmoor went to the window, looked once at the dust settling on the empty lane, and did not move. "He wants me angry and on the road with no authority and no witness," the Duke said. "I won't do it." He turned from the window, and his face was grim but composed in a way she was beginning to recognize. "He's frightened. That matters more than the box." What came after was a kind of war, fought entirely on paper. Ketch did not disappear. He sent lawyers, he sent documents, a death register bearing Nell's family name, certified and witnessed and 8 years old, a physician's attestation, the indenture, lawfully drawn, lawfully signed, a dozen witnesses to it, and he sent something more carefully aimed than any of it. A letter from his solicitor declaring that a domestic at Greave House, coached by a disgraced former trustee, had fabricated a claim to a dead woman's inheritance. The miniature she claimed to possess was a copy easily produced. Any second miniature would be a forgery. The genuine article had been with the family for years, its whereabouts fully documented. They had had 8 years to build this. Every document the Duke might produce, they had already written an older version of. Every witness he might call, they could call first and pay better. The death register was theirs. The physician had since relocated. The indenture was witnessed and sealed. And then a writ came from the county court, a removal order naming Nell as a domestic without legal standing, to be remanded to the custody of the estate's legacy pending resolution of what the court called a fraudulent claim of inheritance, to the custody of the man who had kept her. The Duke's lawyers fought the writ through 3 postponements and lost the 4th. It was a lawful order from a lawful court, and rank did not override process. The Duke could delay. He could not stop it indefinitely. They came on a gray Tuesday, 2 officers of the county court, correct and unhurried, with the writ in a leather portfolio and a closed carriage waiting in the drive. Nell stood in the drawing room in her gray dress and watched the Duke argue and watched him lose. She understood, in that moment, the full shape of what had been done. Every piece of the truth had been made to look younger than the lie. The death register was older. The indenture was older. Ketch's version predated hers at every turn, so that every truth she offered would arrive looking like a thing invented to answer a story already established and accepted. Older document beats newer claim. That was the whole of their armor. She's to come with us, the senior officer said, not unkindly. The order is clear, Your Grace. You may petition the court. You may send lawyers to argue on her behalf. But she comes today. The order names her. Nell looked at the Duke. He had gone still in a way she recognized. The way a person goes still when they are searching through everything they know for something they have not yet thought to use. She watched him search, and she watched him find nothing. She watched his shoulders settle, just slightly, with the particular resignation of a man who has reached the end of what he can carry alone. Your Grace, she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. Maisie had told her not to shrink. Thank you for asking. No one in 8 years ever asked who I was or what I remembered. Whatever comes now, someone asked. That is more than I had a week ago. The officer began to move toward her. The Duke said, Wait. Something had changed in his face. The stillness was still there, but underneath it something else had surfaced. Not desperation, not quite hope, but a cold and level and very patient clarity, like a man who has just remembered at the very last moment precisely what he has already done. It was the same look he had worn on the first morning, when he set the inventory on the table and asked for a pen. You will take her north on the strength of that writ, he said. His voice was perfectly even. I understand the law and I won't obstruct it. He crossed to the long table without haste and set his hand flat on the surface. But before she goes, I would ask you to note something for the court that issued your order. A small matter of record. It concerns the question of sequence. He reached into his coat and drew out a document, folded at the creases, worn from being carried close for 10 days. He opened it on the table. Your writ names a domestic fixture, he said, a property asset, to be remanded into custody. Its legal basis is that she is listed as a thing, and a thing may be moved and handed about without anyone being obliged to ask whether it has a right to object. That is the whole of the writ's foundation. He smoothed the paper flat. It is unfortunate for those who drew it that 10 days ago, before any writ was issued, before any letter from any solicitor, before Gowan Ketch sent a single document in any direction. On the morning I read Section IV of this estate's inventory and found a human being catalogued between kitchen copperware, I refused to countersign the deed of transfer as written. He turned the paper so the officers could see it. I struck the clause from the deed and wrote an amendment in my own hand. I had it witnessed that same morning by Mr. Driscoll, Ketch's own solicitor, who was present in this room, and the amended deed was filed with the county registry the same afternoon. He looked at the senior officer steadily. I declined to accept the transfer of any person as property, on the grounds that no person may be so transferred, and I recorded that the individual named in Section IV was to be regarded as a free subject, pending determination of her status at law. That notation is dated, signed, witnessed by your own county's solicitor, and registered. It is 10 days older than your writ. He set the paper down. Your writ requires the removal of a property asset. The registry had already recorded, 10 days before your court issued that order, that there is no property asset here and has not been since the morning I set my pen to this page. A registered amendment to a filed deed of transfer, witnessed and dated before the writ was drawn, outranks the writ in any court that observes proper sequence. You cannot seize as property what the law has already formally declared a person. The room was very quiet. The senior officer leaned over the table and read the amendment. He read it again, slowly, the way the Duke had read Section I on the first morning. Not because the words were difficult, but because he was making absolutely certain of what they said. Then he straightened, and he looked at Nell, and something crossed his face that was not quite pity and not quite apology, and was perhaps the closest a man in his position could come to either. I'll carry this writ home unserved, he said at last. There's a question of precedence here well above my station, and I'll not put my neck in it. If the court wishes to press the matter, they may do so in open session with lawyers present on both sides." He closed the portfolio. "For what it's worth, miss, I've served a good many orders. I've a nose for the ones that have been drawn in bad faith. This one had that smell from the morning it was handed to me." He went out. The carriage left the drive empty. Open court was what Ketch had least wanted, and what he got. The Duke's amendment was 10 days older than the writ. The writ was older than Ketch's documentary defense. The sequence, once a court was required to examine it, forced the examination of everything else. The income drawn from the Greave estate for 8 years, the death register signed in a hand that a surviving clerk could show, had also certified 2 other convenient deaths for Ketch's associates over the same period, and the horses in the stable yard, 3 of which carried a brand matching the Greave estate's own original stock records, recorded in the old master's hand 30 years before. Ketch, brought before a magistrate in a jurisdiction where his money reached considerably less far than he was used to, weighed the cost of silence against the cost of testimony, and chose the lesser. He testified for 4 hours. He named the people who had paid him to keep a child hidden and a death registered as real. He produced the music box. It was in his locked traveling case, where he had carried it for 10 days rather than destroy it, for reasons that perhaps said something about the man he was underneath all the rest of it. The miniatures were set side by side on the magistrate's table. The mother's face in the Duke's gilt frame and the same face in Nell's music box, and the name inscribed on the lid of the box matched the name recorded in the Greave family Bible in her father's own handwriting. It was enough. The estate had never legally passed out of the Greave line. It had been held in false trust for 8 years, and the courts, once they were finally permitted to look at it properly, said so in plain language. 2 years later, Nell was in the stable yard at Greave House when the dark chestnut with the white sock foaled in the early April light. She had kept the horse. The Duke had offered to take him back to Aldenmoor, but she had asked him to leave the animal at Greave, because it was the horse that had stopped Evander cold in the yard on the first morning, the horse he had recognized from the old Greave stock records, and she felt that sort of thing deserved a certain loyalty in return. She was not called Nell anymore, though Maisie still called her that sometimes. Nell, where did I put the good shears? And always would, and that was entirely fine. She had her own name back, her father's name, the name inscribed on the lid of the music box in handwriting she had finally learned to read. It fit differently now than it had on the first day the magistrate read it aloud in open court. A name, like warmth, comes back slowly to something that has been without it for a long time. Maisie lived at Greave House with her now, and would to the end of her days, because that had never been a negotiable matter. The deed of transfer hung framed in the study, alongside the inventory. Visitors read Section IV and went quiet, and then read the single line written beneath it in a different, firmer hand. I decline to accept the transfer of any person as property, as no person may be so transferred. The individual named in this section is a free subject, her status to be determined by law, not by this ledger. Aldenmoor. The first time Nell had seen it framed, she had wanted to burn the whole thing. "Keep it," Evander had said. "It's the thing that saved you. Read the line beneath the line." So it stayed. They had married in the autumn, in the small church at the edge of the Greave property, with Maisie and the solicitor and 4 neighbors as witnesses, because neither of them had any particular use for ceremony, having each spent too many years being counted and categorized by people who cared for such things a great deal more than was warranted. He had asked her on a Tuesday afternoon in the stable yard. Without preamble, She had said yes in exactly the same spirit, because there had never been any real question. Not since the morning he had drawn out a chair in the cold drawing room and asked, rather than told, her to sit. On the morning of the wedding, Maisie pinned the last pin and stepped back and looked at her with the expression of a woman who has been proved right about something she always knew, but had the good sense not to say too loudly. "I told you to go in with your head up," Maisie said. "I told you to answer him plainly." "You did, and he saw you." She pressed her lips together, not quite containing the rest of it. "You were always what you were. They only ever had you misfiled." Nell held her hands for a moment and did not trust her voice with an answer. On the table by the window, where the April light came in long and level across the old oak, lay the pen. The same pen Evander had asked for, on the first morning, a plain clerk's pen, nothing remarkable about it at all. He had meant to keep it. She had taken it quietly when he wasn't watching and carried it upstairs, the way she had once carried and hidden the only other thing that had ever truly belonged to her, and he had let her because he understood exactly why. She picked it up now and turned it once in the light. She thought of a gray morning and a long table and a line in an estate ledger filed between the linen press and the kitchen copperware, and a man who had read all the way to the bottom of a list, the part where the cheap things went, the forgotten things, the things beneath anyone's notice, and found, written there in a solicitor's careful hand, a person, and had set the paper down, and had looked across the room, and had asked very quietly for a pen. She set it back on the table. In the yard below, the foal called out in the new morning light, and its mother answered, and Rosabelle Greville, no longer a line in anyone's ledger, no longer a fixture in anyone's inventory, went down to be married,